Okay, so now I would like to take up the interesting question of this Tibetan letter, which is called A-chung, or little a. And this has been highly controversial in the field. Lots of people have different ideas as to what it stood for. And there are lots of different ways of writing it. If you see on page 8, different scholars have very different ways of writing it. Now, A-chung occurs in 3 positions in the written Tibetan syllable, one of which is less important than the others. We won't talk about them, talk about it too much. It occurs either initially before a vowel or pre-consonantally. In a pre-vocalic position, it seems to have a glottal feature. So in some dialects of Tibetan, you actually get a velar fricative, like r or ch, before the vowel, where you have A-chung before a vowel. It sometimes is r, sometimes ch, sometimes glottal stop, in the various dialects. Pre-consonantally, it's a different story. Pre-consonantally, it definitely seems to be a nasal. And there's all kinds of evidence for this. In Jackson Sun's MA dissertation on a dialect of Indo-Tibetan, Dzogchen Indo-Tibetan, he points out that written Tibetan A-chung before a consonant corresponds to prenasalization in the Amdo dialect. There are examples here on page 10. We have these 2 columns, written Tibetan and Dzogchen Amdo. Okay, so in written Tibetan, where you get the A-chung, in this dialect of Amdo, you get prenasalization. Same thing happens with the m-prefix. So how come Tibetan has 2 nasal prefixes? It has both the m and the A-chung. And again, Jackson has a good explanation for this. The m prefix in Tibetan was undoubtedly pronounced something like this. Because if you get 2 nasals in a row without some kind of vowel in there, it's kind of difficult to pronounce. You can't really say that. So this represents a kind of sesquisyllabic sequence. So you have this minor syllable and the major syllable, a syllable and a half. But in the case of prenasalized ones, native speakers aren't aware necessarily that there were 2 phonetic features of it. For them, it's just a single sound. And so to write it this way would be, with the actual m prefix, would be not very consonant with native speakers' intuitions. So what they have in common, though, these 2 prefixes, m before a consonant and A-chung before a consonant, is that they only occur before voiced sounds or aspirated sounds, not before simple surds. So you get things like Mikase or Maga, making things up. But you don't get Maka. So obviously they have some kind of relationship. And in the dictionaries, they occur one after the other. You get the order of the prefixes in Tibetan dictionaries, this is on page 12, is G, D, B, M, A-chung, R, L, S, and so forth. So the M and the A-chung are recognized to be similar. Okay. Other pieces of evidence for that, this is on page 11 now, that in central and western dialects of Tibetan, in compounds with a second element begins with A-chung, the latter is sometimes pronounced with a nasal onset. So My written Tibetan pronunciation is not so good, but let's say to get dun becomes gen dun, ka dun becomes kan dun, and so forth. So it's a nasal. Interestingly, there are good correspondences between words with written Tibetan A-chung and Proto-Burmese cognates with prenasalized initials. As I said before, when you have a voiced consonant in lahu, that comes from a prenasalized initial in Proto-Burmese. So you get several examples of written Tibetan words with A-chung, which correspond, say, to lahu words with voiced initials. So to drink, da in lahu, a tung, a ja, a drop, ju to prick or stick, ja to sneak or sling. This one is not so great because it goes back to jak, not to chup. But they look kind of related. Even in written Burmese, the word for this is di. This might be a relatively recent word in Burmese, but it shows the same kind of tendencies. Okay. Post-vocalically, A-chung is only an orthographic device, so we're not going to talk about that too much. Okay, going to page 12 now. There are interesting examples of the prenominal use of A-chung, which show variation between A-chung and another prefix. So, flee, jiba, lejiba, head, go, mago, jig for neck, another word for neck, word for tadpole. We don't have a proto-form for that. So it looks as if there might have been more than one prefix to those particular words. Okay, and there are various correspondences you can find. These are kind of random examples among our prefixal variants across subgroups of Tibeto-Burman. So there are correspondences between A-chung in Tibetan and syllabic nasal in Lota. Some nice examples: jibspa to suck, Int'l to kiss in Lota, to suck face, as some people say. Insect, another one, bu angbao. Correspondences between A-chung and mikir ing. Correspondences between m and ang, words for liver and stinking smell. Between m and mikir ing ang. Yeah. And we get to mikir and a. We don't have to go into all these details. Yeah. So the main thing I want to leave you all with is that several different variants of the prefix have to be reconstructed. Stressed and unstressed, post-nasalized or not post-nasalized, palatalized or not, and it's much more complex and interesting than if we just reconstruct a for the prefix. Okay. And last but not least, we should mention Chinese, of course, because a in the fully stressed form occurs in many Chinese kinship terms. This is page 14. And finally, some remarks about Indo-European parallels. Proto-Indo-European scholars reconstruct two syllabic nasals, and but in many of the daughter languages, there are partially vocalic reflexes of this. So Proto-Indo-European cum tom, 100. In Latin, you get centum, you get en as the result. In 10 decum, reconstruct that way, we get em. And these other examples. Immortal is a privative or negative prefix syllabic n, and it becomes a in Sanskrit and Greek. A privative is sometimes called amrta. Ambrotos is where we get the word ambrosia. It was the drink which made the gods immortal. Immortalis in Latin. You get un in English with a vowel, in Latin. The word for foot, it's also an accusative suffix, pedum, poda in Greek, pedem in Latin, the accusative. The difference is that in Indo-European, the nasal component is viewed as primary, with the vocalic element treated as secondary. But in my way of looking at things, I consider the nasal component to be secondary, and the nasal component should be secondary to the glottal component. But this could be a distinction without a difference, because how can you pronounce these things without putting in vowels, even at the proto form? You've got to have some kind of schwa-like thing in there.